It's a real honor to be joined by Yuk Hui, who's in Hong Kong at the moment, to celebrate his new book, Art and Cosmotechnics. I can send also some shout outs to Colin Beckett from e-flux Books and Peter Martin from University of Minnesota Press, who were really instrumental in bringing the whole book together. As with many other things, this launch was something that we had wanted to do in person at e-flux. And so hopefully we can still organize a kind of continuation in the coming year if circumstances permit. To briefly introduce the book we are celebrating today. Yuk's Art and Cosmotechnics could be said to depart from two central questions. In light of current debates on robotics and AI, how can various experiences of art help us rethink technology today? And how can today's art, overshadowed by global trends and market forces, reestablish a relation to truth, even when that relation has come to be dominated by science and technology? Coursing through Greek tragedy, cybernetic logic, and the aesthetics of Chinese Shanshui painting, Art and Cosmotechnics addresses the challenge that technological transformation poses to art and philosophy now by proposing to revisit the varieties of experience of art. Art and Cosmotechnics departs from Hegel's end of art thesis and Heidegger's claim that cybernetics heralds the end of European philosophy and metaphysics. But what would such a post-European relation between art and technology actually be? Is it something that we have ever witnessed before? Instead of interpreting Heidegger's verdict as a catastrophic end or an opening for anti-European reactionary thinking, Hui proposes another agenda for reformulating the task of thinking, which he demonstrates by strategically elevating aesthetics, traditionally defined as a lower faculty of cognition, to logic. To prepare for renewing the relation between art and technology, Art and Cosmotechnics takes readers to an unfamiliar world in which tragic drama confronts Shanshui painting. German idealism mirrors cybernetics and conceptual art, and Hegelian dialectics contrasts Taoist logic. Art and Cosmotechnics asks how a systematic recomposition of thinking can mount a new approach to the closed world of modern industrial machines and transform their logic of capture and containment, shedding new light in a destitute time. So the format for today is quite straightforward and quite simple. I have a series of questions. Oh, you went to the beach. I have a series of questions that I will ask you about the book as really just openings, because the book is a huge endeavor. Each chapter could be said to be kind of like a small book on its own. And so these are really just attempts to create either a pathway through it or certain openings to bring the book closer to you, who I imagine those of whom who may not have read it word for word already. And if you have, congratulations, and I hope you will also learn more about it from this discussion. Shall we begin?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much, Brian and e-flux for organizing this. But also, I want to thank so e-flux, but also University of Minnesota Press for bringing this book to light. And it's a lot of effort, and Brian also did a lot of work on that in terms of reviewing it and so on. So thanks everyone, and also for organizing this event. my great pleasure to be here. So I changed my my background image to a morning beach. So then, because it's morning here, so you can have a contrast with the Brooklyn evening.
Yeah, hopefully our two different sides of planetary fatigue will sort of cancel each other out, because for Yuk it's the morning and maybe he's having his coffee. For me it's the evening. So we're on opposite sides of of mental clarity. So for my first question, maybe we can start with a bit of background before we get very specific about the book. Also because the book, in turning its focus to art and aesthetics, it builds upon some concepts that you've dealt with in depth before as a philosopher. The most obvious one is the concept you're best known for, which is also in the title of the book, Cosmotechnics, and which you elaborated in your 2016 book on the question concerning technology in China, an essay in cosmotechnics. So maybe we can begin by situating ourselves around the meaning of this concept. Also because I think, it's important to protect it from certain misunderstandings that may have arisen in the time since you wrote the question concerning technology, since even the most necessary critiques of Western-dominated political or technological paradigms can become increasingly vulnerable to reactionary tendencies or wrongful appropriations.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that this book is quite a strange book, because it's strange because it talks about three kind of different logic, and from the at the first glance they don't seem to be related at all. So, for example, this book talks about Chinese thought, Taoist thought, and cybernetic thought or cybernetic thinking. And I don't think that there has been any work for trying to really associate these three together. And they also form as you said, it's divided into three parts. So, but I'm going to explain why this book is structured like this. But before we do that, I want to respond to your question, the concept of cosmotechnics. But I think best I will try to explain why I have to coin this concept of cosmotechnics before I explain what it really is, and also the difficulty of elaborating such idea of cosmotechnics or such concepts. It's because something very personal is that I have been studying philosophy for. I firstly studied computer science, and then I moved to study philosophy for many years. And I wanted to focus my studies on philosophy of technology. And after 10 years, I found that more than 10 years, I found that all I have studied are supposed to be something universal. But at the same time, the philosophy of technology that I was studying were actually very much European. I mean, a little bit American, but very much European. So at a certain moment, I asked myself, what would be, what does it mean by technology in cultures outside of Europe? We know there must be technology outside of Europe. Only idiots can deny this. So we know that there were technology outside Europe, and according to historians, that the Greek technology were actually firstly from the Near East, the Near Orient. From the Near Orient to Greek, and then stay in Greece and Roman period, and then during Christianity, technology is become an object of hate. Not until the Renaissance and later on, and then there was after the end of the 14th century, there was a huge change in Europe, and then we see slowly the emergence of European modernity. So, according to historians, even Greek technologies had its origin from the Near East. But this is not a subject we want to enter into, because then it involves a lot of historical discussions with the classicists. But I was quite amazed by the fact that it seems like there is a lack of understanding of the concept itself, because the whole discourse is very much structured around European history and European philosophy. I'm not saying that this is bad, maybe they offer some good insight. But at the same time, I was very curious what would be, what could be how could we articulate technology, the question of technology outside of Europe, for example. But immediately we encounter a difficulty, a huge difficulty. Is that because we were told, since the very beginning of our child, since we were born, that science and technologies are universal, like mathematics. So in a way, we have accepted the idea that technology is universal, science is universal, logic is universal, mathematics is universal, and so on. And even in the academic disciplines, it seems that there is a lack of reflection on such question. So let me give a few examples. So, for example, in philosophy of technology, especially, in analytic philosophy of technology, everything is universal. For continental philosophy of technology, for example, Heidegger has been an influential figure. And Heidegger's 1949 talk in Bremen, and later published as The Question Concerning Technology in 1953, basically suggests that if we want to understand what technology is, or what he called the essence of technology, then maybe we can understand it in two parts. One part is what the Greeks called techne. And techne for Heidegger means, is associated with poiesis, with bringing something forth, or hervorbringen for Heidegger. And this poetic realization is also the unconcealment of being. And so the question of being comes to his discourse, and closely related to the concept of technology, but also the concept of art. And that is another subject that he wrote in around 1935 and 1936, the origin of the work of art. Now, the second part is that he's trying to show that the essence of modern technology, so he emphasized the modern technology, and for him that something came out after the scientific revolution, mostly end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, the development of technology after scientific revolution. And he trying to say that the essence of modern technology is no longer the same as techne, is no longer technical, but what he called enframing, Gestell, meaning that everything could be treated as resource, or what he called standing reserve, Bestand, that everything become resource to be exploited. Like the river, the water is used to generate electricity, and all the phenomena we observe today, we witness today in contemporary and modern technologies. So Heidegger's discourse on the difference between Greek techne and modern technology was not only widely accepted, in continental Europe, but also in the East. Also in the East, in Japan, in China, Korea, maybe other parts of Asia. I have no details, but at least from the cultures that I know, outside of Europe that Heidegger's thesis was widely accepted for many reasons. One of the main reasons is that what Heidegger was trying to say seems to have mirrored the tension between tradition and modern. So, for example, for the Chinese or for the Japanese, they would see, they would associate the Greek techne with tradition, and modern technology with, modernization or westernization. So you see there is a conflict, and that's also, I think that was one of the reasons it's accepted. But here there's a blind spot, of course, because what is the meaning of technology? And the meaning of technology that Heidegger gives to technology. So, for example, the enconcealment of being, in the Greek sense, in the Greek technique. I mean, this would not be the case, for example, in China or in Japan. Not at least that the question of being was not really a subject in China or in Japan. Or in general, in Eastern philosophy, being is not the core question. But in Western European philosophy, or the Greek philosophy, it starts around the question of being. So, even though Heidegger's thesis was adopted, but there was a lot of the blind spot remains, and because people tend to already equate the Greek technique with Chinese, Japanese, or Indian technology, without really looking into the meaning of technology that was already present in the discourse of Heidegger. So this is philosophy of technology, but also in the history of technology. For example, the great sinologist Joseph Needham, who has published 26 volumes of Science and Civilization in China, a great, he did a tremendous work on Chinese thought and on Chinese science and technology, not so much on thought, but Needham trying to show that China's science and technology were quite advanced before the 16th century, and his haunting question was, why didn't modern science and technology happen in China or in India, but only in Europe? So historians also trying to show, following Needham, trying to show that, for example, certain technology, for example, let's say paper making in the 2nd century in China was more advanced than in Europe. So you compare if one technology is more advanced than the same technology, in the other region, without really taking into account that Needham himself has warned that in fact all these technologies may, even though they involve similar material and similar product, but actually they are based on different epistemologies and different ontologies. So different technology has different ontological and epistemological assumptions. Even though sometimes they may have similar products, but actually there's a tremendous difference between them. However, by simply compare which one is more advanced than the other, we universalize technology by by default we admit that they are the same. So in anthropology of technology, so we went through philosophy of technology, history of technology, but also in anthropology of technology, we know that technology has been understood as essential parts of the process of harmonization. So to cut it short, because we don't have much time, as externalization of memory, liberation of organs. But this is only a universal aspect or universal dimension of technology. So therefore, I introduce what I called the antinomy of the universality of technology. So the thesis says that technology is universal. because it is the externalization of memory and liberation of organ. But the antithesis says that where technology is not universal, it is conditioned, and by conditioned I mean motivated and constrained by a certain cosmology. That means its locality. So this is the antinomy I put forward, and you know that an antinomy means that when each thesis is separated and looked upon individually or independently, they are all correct. But when you bring them together, you see a contradiction. So the antinomy of the universality of technology presented itself as a contradiction. But this contradiction also leads to what I coined as cosmotechnics, and that all technologies are actually cosmologically constrained and motivated. And there is no theoretical cosmology per se, but cosmology is always embedded and embodied in the development and in the invention, development, and use of technologies. So that's on the question concerning technology in China, and let's say in cosmotechnic, and you can already see from the title that it is actually a response to Heidegger's 1949 talk, the question concerning technology. But also I try to reinterpret the concept of technology by coining a different concept, cosmotechnic, in order to show, or in order to call for a new understanding, new interpretation of technology by situating it historically and cosmologically and locally.
Thank you, Yuk. Should I move on to the next question?
Right, yeah.
Okay, we're sort of making, we're making very large leaps now to cover the territory. Thank you for your answer to the first question. For the second one, I wonder if we could also clarify here our interest in cybernetics. So we're still kind of in the 1940s, no? So your following book, after the question concerning technology, in your 2019 book, Recursivity and Contingency, dealt with the significance of cybernetics as a world historical, political, and philosophical rupture in Western thinking, right? Because of its use of feedback, circularity, and recursion, right? So this is really going back to the physics of information as Norbert Wiener defined it in the 1940s with cybernetics. And right, so this use of feedback, circularity, and recursion, you explain as dissolving a certain separation in Western thinking between organic life and machinic systems. And you very eloquently described this in the book as a situation where machines are no longer simply tools or instruments, but rather the gigantic organisms in which we live, right? So this act of enframing is somehow also moves into this, but in a kind of organic and machinic body of cybernetics. Could you describe further the conditions of this merger and perhaps also the kind of cosmic or cosmological implications of living inside gigantic organic machines?
Right, thank you. So I think the best way I do this is in that, I continue what I said. I will start from where I finished, because and it's a way to answer your question about my interest in cybernetics. Is when I was after I finished the question concerning technology in China, I felt something is not done, and I was haunted by Needham, by Joseph Needham. I thought that I have resolved, because I try to resolve his question But at the same time, I felt that in that book, my 2016 book, it was not, I missed something. And there was an urgency for me to work on that. It's because you know, in the 20th century, if you ask, for example, sinologist or someone who studied Chinese thought, or even the Chinese philosophers, so what are your, you know, if you ask them, what is the difference between Chinese thought and European thought or Western thought? What's the difference between Chinese technology and Western technology? And you often hear this reply, oh, Chinese thought is organic, Western thought is mechanic. I'm sure that some of you have heard of this answer. And you know, to some extent, I think Joseph Needham has to be partly responsible for this, you know, really problematic answer, because, you know, that was what he tried to say in his books, and that he tried to say that Western philosophy, only from Leibniz on, is organic or becomes organic. So Joseph Needham, in the second volume of Science and Civilization China, he started with Leibniz. He gives names to, you know, Leibniz, Spinoza, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, and go down to Whitehead and Norbert Wiener, cybernetics. You know, of course, with people like Harden, with Schmutt, and so on in between, Morgan, and so on. Those who are associated with holism and so and organicism, so on. But so that was Needham says that, you know, Western philosophy only become organic after Leibniz and until cybernetics, and he said, but then Chinese philosophy since the very beginning is organic. So Chinese thought has not passed from mechanism to organism. So that's Needham's claim. And then he continued by saying that, but you know, Leibniz was probably influenced by his correspondence with the Jesuit. You know, because Leibniz was in letter correspondence with Father Bouvet, a Jesuit at the time in China. And Needham continued by saying that, well, maybe Leibniz was influenced by the Neo-Confucian Zhuxi, you know, one of the most important Neo-Confucian of the 11th, 12th century, and I felt that this question, you know, this way of formulating Chinese thought and Western thought is problematic in many senses. You know, first of all, it may reintroduce Orientalism, and secondly, it may not help us to clarify really what Chinese thought or Chinese technology is, and there is an urgency to really understand what does it mean, or how to articulate Chinese science and technology without recursing to an organicism or holism. And this is the problem we have today, especially, for example, if you look at Chinese medicine, it's always about holism. But holism is, you know, is a German invention, we know. So that was something I wanted to work on, the concept of the organic, and how I actually trying to show that, you know, in fact, no, the concept of organic is fundamental for the West. It's fundamental for the West, and probably more fundamental in the West than in China, because there was no discourse of organism in China. You know, the Chinese was not aware of that, such as the Chinese was not aware of what is tragedy in the Greek sense. You know, even today when we say tragedy, we thought it's a sad story, but it's not. So that's how I try to work on the concept of organic, and That's also you can see it as a continuation of my book on the question concerning technology in China. And in the preface of the book, I said it could have been called, recursivity and contingency could have been called the specter of Needham, of Joseph Needham. So in this study, I actually trying to show that I use this study to relate the history of Western philosophy. Because I think this is very important, the dichotomy or the opposition between mechanism on the one hand and organism in the other hand was one of the most significant philosophical events in the 18th century in Europe. We know that in modern European thought, that's what we call early modernity, associated with people like Descartes and so on. It was very much dominated by a mechanism or mechanistic thinking. So, for example, the equivalence between the human body and the machine. Now, that was, the writing of Descartes, for example, on the discussion of the body or on men, for example, these two later treatises from Descartes, basically, you can find many examples of describing the human body according to mechanism. For example, comparing the human body with the organ in the church, for example, and how the wind related to the blood, and how the organ, the pump related to the heart, and so on. And this mechanism was very much challenged in the 18th century, and because of the rise of the concept of organism. And let's don't forget that at this moment on, let's don't forget that at this moment on, biology was not yet a scientific subject. Now, in the 18th century, biology was not really part of Naturwissenschaft. Biology only appeared as a discipline at the beginning of the 19th century. But the rise of the concept of organism was significant that we can find in the work of Goethe, in Kant, but of course already in Leibniz, and in the 17th century with the Platonist school in Cambridge. But I was trying to show that in fact in Kant's critique of judgment, the critique of judgment, I think for many people who study art, must have read part of it. At least the first book. That's to say the analytic, on aesthetic judgments, on the beautiful and the sublime. But if you pay attention to the book, that the second part is called on teleological judgments, is actually on biology. It's on biology, and these two are linked. But I'm not going into this relation in Kant critique of judgment. But I was trying to suggest, and I tried to cut it short, is that basically Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment imposed a new condition of philosophizing towards the end of the 19th century, because the book was published in 1790. So what do I mean by organic condition of philosophizing? I mean that for philosophy to be, it has to become organic, or it cannot avoid becoming or being organic. So you find in all the post-Kantian idealists, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and that's what I'm trying to show in recursivity and contingency, how the concept of organic is fundamental to the understanding of politics. You find in Kant, in Hegel, in nature, in Schelling, in the I, in Fichte, and so on. Not to mention that in the 20th century, we find in Whitehead, we find in Joseph Needham, and so on. So basically, I made a huge claim, and to some extent, I feel that it's justified that towards the end of 18th century, there was actually, Kant imposed a organic condition of philosophizing that was based on the irreducibility between organism and mechanism. However, I try to show that this situation has greatly changed in the 20th century after the rise of cybernetics. And basically, cybernetics aim is trying to, again, I have to put it very briefly because we are running out, we may not have enough time. That what cybernetics was trying to do, was suggesting is something really fundamental and extremely important for us today. People, when people talk about cybernetics, they will say cybernetics is about control, is about, it's bad, about surveillance, but this is completely naive of saying this, because the basic claim of cybernetics is the following. I simplify it is, in the 1948 books of Norbert Wiener, what he claims is that cybernetics has overcome the dichotomy between mechanism and vitalism. So vitalism, represented by Besson, by Harden, by or Hans Tiesch, for example, that propose concepts such as élan vital and Lecky to describe a vital force in the organism. So Norbert Wiener starts by opposing mechanism, where he used Newton as one example, but of course Newton is not Descartes, but Newton stands as the representative of mechanism and of classical, mechanics, and then you have vitalism, which is Besson and others. So he opposed them, and after he opposed them, he basically saying that but the cybernetic machines is now capable of overcoming the opposition between the two, and that means that a cybernetic machine is able to assimilate the behavior of an organism. So the Bessonian time, Newtonian time is no longer opposed for cybernetics. So cybernetics become a unifying logic based on its feedback system. So unifying logic. So Hans Jonas, the philosopher who used to teach at the New School, as a former student of Heidegger, and in his book, I forget the name of the book, Phenomenology of the Living or something like that. And in the book, he claims that it's the first time since Aristotle that we found an unifying logic. Significant, first time since Aristotle we find a unifying logic in cybernetics. So that's to say that cybernetics basically overcome dualism. So today, if we still criticize cybernetics machines as dualism, this is a conceptual mistake. So that's to say, since the first half of the 20th century, the machines that we have been witnessing are no longer machines of Descartes' time. It's no longer a machine of Karl Marx time. Marx machines are mechanical machines. These are not cybernetic machines. So, Hans, what says Hans Jonas on the phenomenon of life, for example, and it's kind of philosophical. I see it, he's very critical, but I see it also as a philosophical endorsement of Norbert Wiener's cybernetics. So from cybernetics on, then we see a new paradigm of development machine that I call it the becoming organic of machines. And this becoming organic of the machine is fundamental to the work of Simondon, especially on the mode of existence of technical objects. So in a way, the cybernetics fulfilled what Kant called the organic condition of philosophizing, according to me. And this is also how I interpret what Heidegger calls cybernetics as the end of Western philosophy, or cybernetics marks the end of Western philosophy and metaphysics. So today we are living in a new condition of machineries, but this also calls forth a new condition of philosophizing after Immanuel Kant. So if in the 19th century, towards the end of 18th century, consider the publication of Critique of Judgment in 1790, we have been experiencing an organic condition of philosophizing that we found finally in Whitehead and in cybernetics, but also today, in Donna Haraway. Now we have to re-articulate this condition of philosophizing, and for me, we cannot simply go back to the organic. We cannot go back to the a kind of multi-species or a kind of discourse. And Recursivity and Contingency was a book that tried to look for this condition, try to elaborate on this condition of new condition of philosophizing. And I also try to associate this, the fundamental question is that how can we articulate philosophy, or how can philosophy respond to the post-cybernetic time? And this is also for me the task of art. And that is why I wrote this book, Art and Cosmotechnics, even though I'm no expert of art at all.
Well, that brings us perfectly to the next question, which moves now finally into the Art and Cosmotechnics book. But I think also these moves from cosmotechnics to cybernetics, and then now to art and aesthetics are very profound on their own. So if we are to move then from cybernetics directly into art and aesthetics, then we might say that in the book you outline a new way of thinking about art and aesthetics that follows from these enormous and transformative systems, cosmology and technology. But your approach runs contrary to many kind of vulgar approaches to technology that simply normalize in art the invasion of gizmos and doodads into our lives, where you make art with computers or social media platforms, but often it's done in the name of broadening the limits of art or aesthetics. Strangely, though, usually in this kind of broadening of art and aesthetics using technology, they almost never question the limits of the current technological paradigm itself, and on the contrary, it often mimics its oppressive or kind of deterministic tendencies. Like kind of Black Mirror is a kind of popular example, like Ballardian scenarios. So instead of this, right, you advocate for something completely different, which is a return to certain fundamentals of aesthetics, more specifically by engaging with aesthetics as a form of logic, right? Aesthetics as a form of logic that can be said to precede or even include our current paradigm of technology, right? That is actually larger than it. So could you describe a bit this kind of unusual technique that begins in the book with a turn back to Greek tragedy, or what you term in the book tragist logic, and tell us a bit about your reasoning for it, please.
Right. So thank you. Let me think how to start this. Where to start with these big questions, because this is a big question. So let me try to say in two. Let me try to say in two parts. So first of all, after I finished Recursivity and Contingency, I was haunted I was haunted by the question of, because in the book I try to use the two concepts, recursivity and contingency, to characterize this mode of thinking that exists since Kant. This as recursivity and contingency were the two concepts I used to describe the organic condition of philosophizing since Kant. Now, after I finished this book, that end in cybernetics, and then I was asked also by later asked by Augustin Berg, who wrote endorsements for the book a few years ago, and he said to me that I found your book very interesting, but I'm also disappointed that you didn't talk anything about the East. He said in the East, he's a Japanologist, no? He's an expert of Japan, and he said in Eastern thought, there's also a lot of discussions about contingency and what you call recursivity, and you didn't even say one word about that. So. At the same time, there was also, historically speaking, there was also a lot of discussions on, or maybe discussion is not a good term, many claims that cybernetics is very close to Chinese thought. And there's even a claim that is never proved, which says that cybernetics actually has its origin in China, because Norbert Wiener was a visiting professor at the Tsinghua University between 1932 to 1933 and 34. That's true. He was at that time for 1 year, and he kind of made some remark that Chinese writing was very significant for him to understand, but it's not sure what he was really referring to. But anyway, there's always this myth about cybernetics and Chinese thought, and the whole kind of discourse on Chinese holism and organicism is such a fascinating story that we can discuss elsewhere. But then I have to also have a big challenge, which is to say, I must explain what could be the difference between cybernetics and Chinese thought. If Chinese technology is not cybernetics in the sense of Norbert Wiener, then how can we articulate this? Otherwise, we can then otherwise everything will or we are going to sink into the night where all the clouds are gray, like what Hegel says in the preface of Phenomenology of Spirit, when he criticized the concept of the absolute of sharing and Fichte. So if we don't distinguish this, if we avoid articulating this, and then we are we allow ourselves to fall into darkness without being able to articulate. And for me, philosophy is all about elaboration. You have to elaborate on something, you have to clarify it, make something clear. So that was the task that I set off for myself, and something is behind the book, Art and Cosmotechnics. So since recursivity and contingency, I try to articulate a recursive thinking, and which is fundamental to cybernetics. But I also think that this is I want to say that, but actually there are different forms of recursive thinking. We can put them under the title recursive thinking, but we still need to elaborate on the differences and the relations or the possible relations of these differences. So so then I can go into the second part of your question. What my attempts to go back to tragedy, which is for me also a recursive thinking, a recursive logic. And I will try to explain why I decided to start with the question of logic. It's because that today when you do arts and technology, I think that it's going to be something more and more popular because of the government trying to put money into that, everywhere, but also the university itself probably also need that in order to merge hard science and technology and the humanities. So we can see that this is going to be there's going to be a lot of effort and a lot of investment. But if we can say that in the past decades, the works between arts and technology and humanities was very much, especially for those who work on arts and technology. I'm not saying all, but I think most of them are really fascinated with life experience, interaction, immersions, immerse, and so on. So to some extent, if I can be a little bit harsh, I think most of the things, or many of the things you encounter today, are actually entertainment. Really, entertainment. It's not a bad word, but it's really entertainment. So that means that something is yet to be determined, or something has yet to be asked concerning the relation between arts and technology. So that's what I set off. That's how the book sets off to address this question, the relation between arts and technology. And I think in the aesthetic, in the past century, since Walter Benjamin's text, that's to say, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility, or in the age of technical reproducibility, that was surprisingly also written, in 1935, 1936, the same period as Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art, that produced by two German thinkers during the same period. And on the relation between arts and technology. So let's say from Benjamin's text, in the past 80 years, we can say that he was able to capture the spirit of the avant-garde and also to anticipate a kind of revolution in the concept of art, meaning that Benjamin says that, well, it is probably not productive to ask if photography and cinema are arts or not. He says it is more important to think how technology has changed the concept of art. So I think this is the major thesis that he put forward in the work of arts in the age of technical reproducibility. He made this claim, of course, as a good materialist. That he had to show that it's the materialistic condition that determines the concept, but not the concept that determines the material, determines the reality. Because he was a Marxist. And also that the concept of art has to be enlarged according to a technological condition. So, but today, photography, cinema, these are already widely not only accepted but also institutionalized, in the domain of art. But my approach was almost the opposite. I ask, so if since Walter Benjamin, or even before Benjamin, let's say since the avant-garde, we have been trying to ask how technology changed the concept of art, for example, where you find also in Duchamp and so on. Can we ask, can we turn the question around and ask how can art transform technology? How can art transform technology? And I think this is an important question, not only conceptually, but also in terms of diplomacy. So if you go to talk to an engineer, how are you going to talk to them? Do you simply want to use technology to transform, to create some kind of a new experience, or well, basically you can also influence how technology is made and how technology is conceived and how technology ought to be developed. So it's not only one direction that there was a new, there's a new invention of a new device, a new model, and let's try to use this new model to make us. I think we can also turn the question around by asking, how could art contribute to the imagination of development of technology? If for us today, technology is at the same time a huge opportunity, but also a great, a huge potential catastrophe. I think it's not only potential, if you look at climate change, if you look at the ecological problems, it's not only potential, it's already there. And I think, and that also relates us to, we can also relate it to what Heidegger says, and that we quoted in my response to your first question, that we live in the epoch of the Gestell, of modern technology where everything is considered as standing reserve, as a resource, exploitation of energy, exploitation of the non-human actors and non-human agents and so on. So maybe art and philosophy need to have different role to play today. And this is not to say how, well, we should continue asking how technology transform the concept of arts and philosophy. I think we should. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I think we should and we must do so. But at the same time, we also have to ask how to arts and philosophy transform the concept of technology, imagination, invention, development, and use of technology. And I think this is our task. This is our task, and we better not avoiding it. So if we want to turn this Benjamin's question around, then we have to go back to the question of aesthetics. We have to go back to the question of art. And we have to go back to, if you go back to the question of art, we have to go back to the question of aesthetics. And then where should we start? Because in the aesthetic tradition, we know, for example, since the Alexander Baumgarten's Aesthetica, the first volume was published in 1750. And Aesthetica basically the first line of Aesthetica is claims that the work Aesthetica is an investigation into a lower faculty of cognition. A lower faculty of cognition. And a higher faculty of cognition means logic, because logic is able to deal with clear and distinct ideas. But the aesthetics, which is the lower faculty of cognition, cannot deal with clear and distinct ideas, but only something like emotions, something like feelings. But it doesn't mean, for people like the rationalists like Baumgarten, they also recognize that there is certain truth in aesthetics that we cannot avoid. However, it is, like what Leibniz says, Leibniz, when he said, talk about aesthetic, he said, yeah, there's something there, je ne sais quoi. I don't know what it is. It is the je ne sais quoi, I don't know what it is, that was used to characterize a lower faculty of cognition that is aesthetics. So today, if we continue this discourse of aesthetics, this kind of impressionist idea of aesthetics, then we simply, continue talking about emotions, feelings, and or sort of things like this. But what I was trying to do in this book is that I try to elevate the concept aesthetics to logic. So basically, I not only reverse the question of Benjamin, but I also reverse the discourse of aesthetics since Baumgarten. I try to show that we're actually in aesthetics, we can articulate a kind of the logical form of aesthetics, for example, and so that there's a transition from aesthetics to logic. And I feel like maybe by elevating aesthetics to logic, it may help us to have a better idea how different thinkings, aesthetic thinkings, could be articulated and how they could contribute to the discourse on technology. So that's why I started with, I try to talk about two aesthetic thinkings, or in terms of logic. One is Chagist thinking, or Chagist logic. The other is Taoist logic that I use in the or Sanshei logic. But you know that at the very beginning, I said that this is a strange book because I think no one will ever compare Chagist with Sanshei. For a historian, you may simply dismiss this. But I think that but if you read the book, you understand why I try to make a comparison, or I try to articulate Chagist thinking and the Sanshei logic. Because for me, they actually present two forms of recursive thinking. They are all recursive. Tao is also like turning around, and Chagist is also turning around. But they have a different set of assumptions, and that's to say they all start with contradiction. Both in Taoism or in Taoist thinking, in Chagist thinking, or in let's say in Sanshei painting and in Chagist, it always starts with contradiction. So contradiction is always at the beginning. But how the contradiction is articulated and how the contradiction is resolved are very different in Chagist and in Sanshei painting. So you see that you see that it's my aim of trying to articulate the relation between aesthetics and logic, and it has different. There are many things behind my attempts that I was only able to say a few.
Thanks, Yuk, but it's very informative. I think that it's unfortunate that we can't get into every that we can't get into also many of the steps in the argumentation of the book, because they are quite intricate. But by way of sort of this quick survey that we can do today, I think that the elevation of aesthetics to the level of logic, also in terms of strategy, I think the enlargement, the enlargement that aesthetics offers is also very useful in terms of the kind of capacity of aesthetics on its own. And this is something that you deal with a bit in chapter 1, where there's this wonderful passage about the open, which I wonder about, and also as a possible kind of object for the search for another beginning of modern technology, right? So in this recursive movement that you also make in your argumentation, and in this passage, I'll just read it here. You write, Heidegger aligns the unconcealment of being with what Rilke calls the open. What human Dasein looks at the world, when humanitatea looks at the world in a narrow and closed way, like a subject scrutinizing an object, the earth withdraws itself. The open is not a scientific object, but rather another name for being. To think together with the open is to take into account that which resists closure and objectification. In this process, the regrounding of truth, the truth of being, becomes possible. Regrounding here means rationalizing the non-rational, the non-rational as the incalculable last God, unquote. So I wonder how does this concept of the open reflect or refract the logic of Heidegger's enframing in relation to technology? And how is another path revealed in your exploration of Heidegger's interest in Klee and Cézanne's painting as instances where world and earth, figure and ground can be said to create openings to the unseen, right? And the unseen I think, is a very important part of the open, right? What has not been enframed and captured by technological means or otherwise.
Right. I think if in order to answer your question, first of all, I must explain what does it really mean by unconcealment of being. What does it mean by when we say unconcealment of being? But this is extremely difficult subject to just to say what is being and what is the unconcealment of being. And we have to do this with some certain kind of violence, in my answer to your question, because of we are running out of time. But I will consider in my book, I consider that there are two major contributions to history of philosophy. One is that my interpretation of the concept of being. For the study of Heidegger, and the second is my new interpretation, or my own interpretation of Taoist thinking. Because the way I deal with Taoism, I think that it is rather unusual. You don't really find in Taoist on literatures on Taoism. And also the way I try to put this thought in relation with each other. But let's start with the question of the unconcealment of being, because I think that if we don't clarify this, what does it mean? Then we fail to address the question of open and the rest of the meaning of this sentence that you have just quoted. Because for Heidegger, if the Greek techne, means two things. It means at the same time technology and art. For the Greeks, there was no difference for the word technology and art. They use the same word techne. Now, for Heidegger, it's in the Greek techne that it is able to experience what he called the unconcealment of being. But here lies the most difficult question that haunts everyone, and that may also make people's life really worthless. That many, you can work your whole life on the question of being, and towards the end of your life, you says that actually there is no being. I think that happened to an American philosopher who used to teach in the Stanford, and he translated several books on Heidegger. And a few years ago, he said there's no being. After his whole life of work on Heidegger, that being is an illusion. But I will not say that being is an illusion. I would say that being belongs to a category which I call unknown, or which we call non-rational. So being belongs to the category called non-rational. So non-rational is not irrational. It's not rational. So it's neither rational nor irrational, but non-rational. It's non-rational because it always stays as the unknown. Well, easily we can give example of God. God is not rational. If God is rational, then you will be able to comprehend. God is already not irrational. If God were irrational, then the human being created by God could not be rational at all. But God remains always non-rational and unknown, because if I ask you, Brian, show me God, then you will never be able to show me God. I ask you, can you demonstrate to me the existence of God? Then you fail. You know, the demonstration that we found in Descartes, for example, the famous demonstration of the existence of God is based on a negation of the human itself, because by negating the human itself, then we goes into something that cannot be reached by that is beyond the human capacity, and this can only be this capacity beyond the human being, the human rationality. This is what's called God. You know, this is basically this is Descartes' proof of the existence of God. So being belongs to the category of the non-rational, the category of the unknown. And so when Heidegger says that it's in techne, or it's in the when Heidegger talks about the unconsumment of being, is also this experience with the non-rational, and which allow the humans to find its place in the cosmos, or to situate itself in the world as a historical Dasein. And if I can briefly, I can do violence to the whole discourse. You know, I'm summarizing everything into one sentence. You know? So please bear with me. You find more elaborations. You know, you find more scholarly elaborations in the book. So that's why I said that Heidegger allies unconsumment of being with what Rilke calls the open, because the open is precisely something that cannot be reduced to either rational or irrational, but rather it is something that allow us to situate a work of art, but also a work of art allow us to access to, or at least to get access to the open. Through the work of art, we are in relation to the open through the being at work of the work of art, the energia of a work of art, because work, and again, energia in the sense, you know, being at work. The work of art is always being at work, but what is it working for? It's working towards the open. It works towards that cannot be closed, that cannot be reduced. So that's why I related Heidegger's unconsumment of being to what Rilke called it the open. And for Heidegger, the concept of the unconsumment of being that he characterized the Greek concept of techne, according to Heidegger, is still possible in modern technology. So it doesn't mean that in modern technology, in the epoch of Gestalt, we can no longer talk about the unconsumment of being. Heidegger says, no, we can talk about the unconsumment of being. However, its mode of unconsumment is no longer the same as in the Greeks' time. This mode of unconsumment is what he called herausfordern, meaning challenge. So, for example, if you build a dam to generate electricity, we challenge the river, we challenge the land, we challenge also the villages. Many villages has to be destroyed. So then, the dam can be built. So the unconsumment seems to be the unconsumment of being is still possible in the time of modern technology, but it can only be done through challenging. But this form of challenging also means catastrophe. It means two things. Firstly, overwhelming. You are overwhelmed by a huge, engineering project, or a huge engineering project went into catastrophe, like what we have witnessed, for example, in Fukushima, in Chernobyl, and so on. And there's going to be more and more. And also the pandemic, the pandemic. So for Heidegger, it's still possible, but this possibility is also a danger. This possibility is also a danger, and how are we going to confront this danger today? In related to technology, and here is my question. My major question is that, can we, having this danger in mind, that at the same time we try to transform technology and to allow us to transform in the sense of development of new understanding, new imagination, and new invention. And that is why in the previous answer to your question, I said I want to think of how art transforms technology. So can we think of art and philosophy and so on, transform technology, but relating technology to the open, or to the open? I think open is more not neutral, but more general than the question of being here. To the open, and to without pushing towards catastrophe and self-destruction. Not because at the moment of self-destruction, we realize, the meaning of life. We are able to resituate ourselves at the moment of danger. For example, when someone is diagnosed with cancer, or an alcoholic had a horrible traffic accident, then he or she will stop giving up drinking. In the case of fatal disease or a traffic accident, then the alcoholic is able to situate itself in a different world, different reality, and develop new habit. And we moderns, we are all moderns. No matter where you are, we are all moderns, and we are all alcoholics. But can we transform technology before we hit bottom, before we become before the diagnosis of fatal disease, or before the car crash? Can we do something? That means to transform technology, and so on. So this was the intention on the on my writing on Heidegger's relation to Claire and Cézanne, and because I think that it's precisely in the thinking of Claire and Cézanne, they try to develop a new way to maybe we can say to overcome what Heidegger called ontological difference. That was very clear in Heidegger's own writing when he says, this was written in a postcard that he sent. I think, if I remember correctly, it was written in a postcard that Heidegger sent to friends during Christmas one year. And he says, it comes after a small poem, badly written. Heidegger cannot write a good poem. And it says, I quote, what Cézanne calls la réalisation, the realization, is the appearance of what is present, das Anwesende in the clearing of presence, anwesend in such a way, indeed, that the duality, the or twofold, the Zwiefalt of the two is overcome in the one-fold or in the oneness, the I-fold of the pure radiation of his paintings. For thinking, there is the question of overcoming the ontological difference between being, the question of Sein, and beings, entities. So that's what I try to say about in the chapter about Heidegger, how the necessity, but also the possibility of reassessing, of resituating technology. But I just want to add one point to this, because earlier I said that maybe it is more general to use the concept of the open than being, because I think that Heidegger was able to talk about the unconsumment of being, but as that which characterized technology for the Greeks and even for the modern Westerns, or maybe more precisely modern Germans. So how are the Easterns, going to relate it to this being? As I said, the question of being was not the central question in Eastern philosophy, and this is not from me. I just repeat what Kitaro Nishida, the founder of Kyoto School, says. He said that if the central question of philosophy in the West is being, then for the East is nothing. Well, this is debatable. This is contestable. If we can really say nothing is the central question of philosophy in India, in China, but in the case of China, which I know a little bit, I think that the central question is Tao. Is Tao, Taoism is Tao, and this is why in the question concerning technology, when I try to elaborate the concept of techniques, I use Tao and Qi. Qi means utensil. It's not the same Qi like breathe that we all know if you practice Tai Chi and so on. So that's the last point I want to add to the response to this question.
Thank you, Yuk. So I have two more questions, but this one is this one is second to last question is a serious one, or not, but it's long. It's if we move to the second chapter of the book, this chapter begins by identifying how the logic of this recursive logic, or the logic of self-reflexivity within modern art, actually forms this tautological circular loop, right? So I'll quote again, this time from page 131, if anyone is following. Modernism is characterized by a reflexivity that often takes the form of self-critique. Its language is necessarily tautological. Through a negative detour, a logical contradiction, it reinforces what it negates. This gesture is fundamentally tragist, because its initial negation or refusal is indeed a preparation for affirmation, right? So you continue after this passage by offering Marcel Duchamp's a fountain as an iconic example of this recursive refusal affirmation cycle, right? I think we can be clear that this tautology for you is not self-negating, on the contrary, nor is it necessarily like a dishonest tautology. In fact, you clearly identify it as a tragist logic, right, following Greek tragedy. But we might say that it does sacrifice questions concerning being or the open for more immediate and maybe even more urgent questions concerning industrialization, specifically technologies of mass reproduction. We know from Benjamin to Duchamp to Warhol and onward, and even up to today's contemporary art. Right. Also, we also find this relationship in institutional critique work. So, from this perspective, we might also suspect that modern and contemporary art have habitually confused industrialization with being, right? That there is some kind of a replacement happening. If this is the case, it would be all the more necessary to contrast the tragist logic of this loop of refusal affirmation with what you call Taoist logic, which is to be found in the great centuries-long tradition of Chinese Shanshui painting. But the second chapter is probably the most demanding of the entire book because it synthesizes centuries of scholarship and commentary on Taoist thought to identify how recursive or even paradoxical logics produce meaning, either in the visual field or more generally in what can and cannot be sensed or apprehended. So Shanshui painting can be considered an ultimate expression of the dynamics of this logic in the chapter. But at the same time, I wouldn't even know where to mark a kind of an entry into such an encompassing chapter of the book. So maybe, so I would maybe suggest to that you maybe begin with the centrality of Swan in the system as a place to start, or am I just making the problem worse?
Right, so I think I don't know how much time do we have, Brian. That's the only question is about time, because to answer this question it can take hours or it can take minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I can also move on to the next question, because we're also getting questions from the audience.
Let me try to say this very quickly, because I think this is I mean, this is a key question. The passage that you have cited is actually my commentary on what Clement Greenberg says about Duchamp and what Greenberg calls about modernism. And because, you know, what his claim is basically what Duchamp was doing is not to criticize art, is not to negate art, but to enlarge the concept of art through its negation. So that's why I was called it as a tragist. But we haven't entered into the difference between, we haven't really entered into the tragist logic and Shanshui logic at all, which is really the core of the book. And I don't think that I will be able to do this in a factory way here. But maybe I can start with an interlude, isn't that it was 2016. I was with the sinologist, François Julien. I think many of you know his work. We had a discussion in London, and at this time, one of the friends, the American poet Barry Schwarzsky, raised a hand and asked the question. Asked us the question: the Chinese thought, the tragedy in the Greek sense exists in China. The tragedy in the Greek sense exists in China, or not? If not, why? And I think this is a very, François answered the question by saying that the Chinese develop a thinking to avoid tragedy. And I was amazed by the answer itself, but also I was amazed by the complexity of this question, because I don't think that the Chinese could avoid tragedy. I think the Chinese didn't know what tragedy was. So you want to avoid something, you have to know what it is before you avoid. Otherwise you cannot recognize it. You avoid something only is based on you are able to recognize something. And if you are able to recognize something, you must know it. If you don't know it, then you cannot recognize it. This is the most famous aporio you can find in Plato's Meno. So the Chinese didn't know. I think the Chinese didn't know what does it mean by tragedy for the Greek. And tragedy doesn't mean sad. That's tragic. That's not tragedy. And that's why I make the distinction between tragist on the one hand and tragic on the other hand. And I don't want to confuse tragist as a logic and tragic as something you use in everyday life to say something sad. But tragedy, always starts with a contradiction. This contradiction cannot be reconciled. An irreconcilable contradiction. For example, in Sophocles' Antigone, you found on the one hand that Antigone has to bury her brother who died in the war because there is a law of the family that she, as a sister, has to bury the brother. Not only sister, but also she is a woman. A woman has a different role in the family for the Greeks. On the other hand, because the brother was in a war against the state, against the polis, so as the enemy of the polis, he cannot be buried, according to the law of the polis. So what can you do? What can Antigone do in this situation to follow the law of the family or to follow the law of the polis? And there is, these two are not reconcilable. This is the basic structure of Greek tragedy. Because when I say Greek tragedy, I try to understand Greek tragedy as a logic. Was it because the first sentence of the book by Peter Zondi on tragedy struck me. The first line struck me. When I read it many years ago, he said that since Aristotle, we only have a poetics of tragedy, but only until Schelling, the idealists, then we have a philosophy of tragedy. Difference, poetics, philosophy. In Aristotle, there is only a discourse about emotion, about catharsis, about purification of the soul through tragedy. But only in Schelling we find a logic of tragedy. And Schelling has tried to analyze this basic structure of the tragedy by starting with these irreconcilable contradictions. So a tragic thought is about how to reconcile something that are not reconcilable. So that's what I call the tragic thought, and I'm not going to continue by that. If you are interested, you find more scholarly discourse in the book. And why the Taoist logic is the Taoist logic also start with opposition, but these oppositions are not discontinuous. In the contrary, they are continuous. Having, not having, you, wu, movement, tranquility, for example, yin and yang, for example. So the yin and yang, they're opposed, but they are not. They're not discontinuous. So for the Taoists, they also start with these oppositions, and they also want to reconcile these oppositions in terms of movement, like the Greeks want to do with their tragedy. And how did the secret of this reconciliation or this unification is what is for me. It means it's the task, or it's the elaboration of Tao. But Tao is like being, is something that you cannot really demonstrate. I says that being belong to this category of the non-rational, of the unknown, and so is Tao. And if you open the book of my book, the first sentence you read in the epigraph is the opening of Tao Te Ching, and it says, the Tao that can be said is not the eternal Tao. So the Tao that can be said is not Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name, because it cannot be named, it cannot be said. Wu, which means nothing or not having, is the origin of heaven and earth. You, which means having, being, very complicated translation, the mother of 10,000 things. So we have Wu, like nothing, and You, like being. They're already opposed. One is the origin of the heaven and the earth, and the one is the mother of 10,000 beings. Empty of desire, one perceives mystery. Filled with desire, one perceives manifestations. The two opposed one spring from the same source but differ in name. They come from the same place but they have different name. Both are designated as Shen, and again Shen, gate to all mysteries. So the way to resolve this is Shen and again Shen is, for me, the beginning of a recursive thinking. And because in some, because there are different versions of Tao Te Ching. And in one version, it's written as 闲之又闲之. It means the 闲 becomes a verb. So it's become it's not a, 闲 means, has many meanings. It means darkness in terms of color. It means mysterious. But when it says 闲之又闲之, the 闲 becomes a verb. So then you see that there is a ripping. You see there's a ripping to resolve the opposition. But then the curious question is that, so what is the difference between this recursiveness and the recursiveness of Greek tragedy and the recursiveness of cybernetics? So this is just the opening of a question for of the book. So but only by understanding this recursive logic then are we able to articulate the concept of the open, I would say. So that would be my brief response to your to your complex question.
And we saw also that it's also translated as darkness within darkness, which is
right.
Which is I think it's quite profound. So for my final question then, before we move on to questions from the audience, maybe we can just look very, very briefly at the final chapter of the book, which is not a brief chapter, but it identifies a path forward. I think this is the kind of task of the chapter. But put simply, this path forward means reversing the question of how technology determines art to ask how art can determine technology, right? The reversal that you spoke about before. Specifically, as you wrote, by returning technology to a primordial question of being. As you point out, science and technology have a low tolerance for the unknown, or a kind of hopelessly poor understanding of its significance beyond some kind of a threat to control. So just a very simple question. I wonder how, either in this chapter or more generally in your thinking since you wrote it, how might you delineate something like a cosmotechnical approach to creating art today that could renew a relation to being, to the unknown, over and above the determination of technological enframing or capture?
Right. Well, thank you. This is not a simple question, Brian. This is a question that is no, there's a question also beyond my capacity to answer, because first of all, I'm not an artist, and I'm also not an art historian. I'm not an art critic. I become interested in the question of art because I think that there is a lot of potential in art in different ways. As on the level of thinking, in the terrain of thinking, the art has the capacity, or is still in a position to deterritorialize and reterritorialize thinking. I think it is art still have this possibility. And secondly, I think in the institutional level, whether that is also the reality we have to confront, and not that I like institutions, the opposite is true, but if we have to deal with the question of institution, we have to think about the next generations. Education in the humanities, philosophy, but also engineering and science. How are we going to think of education, or in general universities of the next century? Not the next century, this century. We are already on the 21st century, and so I feel like there is still, something. There's a lot we should think about art, but at the same time, I become also very. I'm myself. I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical of this of the possibility, and if you read my book, you will find towards the end of the book, I wanted to read this out to you. At the last paragraph, I says, this new institutionalization of art has yet to come. Page 286. This new institutionalization of art has yet to come, and it has to go beyond an art designed to serve men's spiritual needs. But it is hard to say whether this institutionalization of art will come to pass, since conventional and conservative practices in the arts and humanities, combined with institutional lack of vision, may be even more efficient than engineering and scientific disciplines in refusing imagination and becoming reactionary. Nevertheless, we still have to prepare for its arrival by providing a ground to think the relation between art, philosophy, and technology today. So basically, this is to say that I have not much to say about the current situation, but I still have the hope. First of all, I'm not cynic, and cynicism is my enemy. It's my biggest enemy. I think we all have to fight against that. We must prepare. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that I can do anything, but I think we should all prepare for something to come. And this is and that's why I still see, in the arts, potential in different levels to deal with these questions. And so how are we going to, the question that I put forward in the book is that, well, how can we relate technology to the unknown at all? If we are able to, for example, integrate the unknown in technology, then we are no longer in modern technology. So the modern technology will disappear. And so the discourse of Heidegger will be finished. If we are able to integrate the question of unknown in our thinking about technology. And this is maybe art will be the interface for that. But I don't, if you ask me how to do it, I will not be able to give you an answer to that, because I think it will involve a lot of effort, and that is far beyond the effort of any one of us. But at the same time, I think that, we need to, the way to overcome modernity, this is one way for me to think of overcoming modernity. Because overcoming modernity in the last century was done through wars. The Second World War was a project for overcoming modernity. You find in the Nazi Germany, because they want to have a holism, or you find in Japan, in the Kyoto school, they want to have an organic thinking, that you can find towards the end of the book my analysis of Nishida and Miki. But maybe there could be other ways to overcome modernity, which is important, which remains an important subject for us today. And maybe war is not the best thing to do, and not the most desirable thing, even though I think we are always on the verge. We always, since many decades, we live in the possibility of war. I'm not saying that the war is going to take place, but we are in the possibility of war. And but maybe there is another path. In the book, I try to describe different paths, and these are obscure paths. And I emphasize obscure because they're not straightforward. They're really obscure. Obscure in the sense of, like, you have to take many detours, you have to turn around many times. And that's why I said at the very beginning, this is a strange book. So maybe I conclude my answer here.
Thank you. Do you mind if we take a couple of questions from
we
the
can
audience before we end?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start from the questions that came earlier on, because they've been coming in as we've been speaking, and I'm sorry to those who hopefully are still with us and have waited for some time to ask them. But there's one, or there are actually maybe two questions from Mario de Lano Rivas. And they're two separate questions. Maybe I'll just ask them together because they're both from Mario. And he says, I'm from Mexico, land of millennia of indigenous cultures with rich cosmologies. And I would like to have some examples of cosmotechnics or cosmotechnical techniques that can unify the cosmos and morality in their practices. You have an example of political or social application. And then there's a kind of follow-up question from Mario. With the three current superpowers having the same Western vision of technology, how can we introduce diversity into this poor vision that is leading us to overexploit the planet?
Right. So thank you. These are two different questions, and I think Mario has already written to my colleague to direct this question to me yesterday. So thank you for your insistence upon this question. Actually, I try to describe this question. I tried to answer this question already in my 2016 book, The Question Concerning Technology, and it will come out in Spanish, I think in early 2023. Recursivity and contingency and cosmotechnic will come out in Spanish in 2022, both of them. So maybe then you can see more examples there. But I try to. I should not just direct you to read my book, because this is a very bad behavior. I have to answer your question properly. So they do have the different cosmotechnics actually. So let me give you two simple examples, very simple. is that, for example, you there was a regulations on the invention of techniques you can find in many cultures. So, for example, when fishermen make their net, there were regulations about the size of the mesh. Is it called a mesh? I don't know. Sometimes I mix up languages. So you have to limit the size of the mesh so that you will not catch small fish. So small fish can go away because you have to preserve them for the next season, for example. There are regulations about the tools that you can use to go to the forest. If you want to cut plants, cut the trees, and there are also regulations about when can you go into the mountain to cut the trees. When can you go fishing? What kind of tools you are allowed to use and you are not allowed to use. So I think you can find many of these examples already in the in different cultures, but they have different explanations. What I said is from a really modern explanation, because the mesh is too small, then we catch too many small fishes, then the next season you have no fish. But in different places, you find different explanations and different discourse, and that are also related to seasonal changes, for example. So this is a very basic example. I'm sure that you can find somewhere else. But also you can find, for example, the example I gave about in China in the Han Dynasty, during the Han Dynasty, is how the cosmos was integrated into the political system. And one simple example, where that's the most important example, is that the empire is considered as the son of the heaven. So the legitimacy of the empire comes from the heaven, but we don't know what the heaven is. But we only know that the heaven moves and manifests or presents us in terms of different seasons. So in Chinese calendar, lunar calendar, we have 24. We have 24 seasonal changes, and there are certain things you can do and you cannot do in different seasons. So, for example, you are not supposed to execute criminals in the spring, because this is against the heaven. Spring is the season for growth, is not the season for death. So even in the execution of a criminal, this has to be done in the winter when everything is dying, the plants and so on are dying. So cosmology does have a social and political implication. So I'm giving you really ancient examples, and there are more examples you can find in my details analysis, but there's still much more to be done. I could only superficially, present some trajectories, some passages, but there is still a lot to be done. That is beyond my own effort, and the research network that I have initiated, called the Research Network for Philosophy and Technology, you can find it online. That we created a new journal called the Technofunny. So the strange name, Technofunny, and you can actually find. We are going to launch one special issue on the question of cosmotechnics in Latin America, with several contributors from Mexico. And I'm sure that you are going to find also that how these cosmologies are thought and rethought today among scholars in Mexico. So we hopefully we are going to launch this issue end of this year. I will be happy to send. I have your email. I will be happy to send along the links. So then maybe it will allow us to have more profound discussion between on the question of Mexico. Now, on your second question is that we are already in a kind of I lost the question. Are the three current superpowers having the same Western vision of technology? How can we introduce diversities? This is a difficult question. And on the one hand, we can be chargist, like what I said. You have to, a chargist that has to accept one's destiny. You have to accept this destiny that after hundreds of years of colonization and modernization, that you cannot go back to the indigenous form of life. You cannot go to the to what it was, in before the contact of civilizations. So we have to affirm this destiny, but affirm this destiny doesn't mean that we have to accept it without reservation, but rather we have to affirm it by not by accepting it, by affirming, but also it means to transform it. And we could transform this according to different localities. We can transform it according to different localities. And this is why I says that we must transform technology, and we should think how arts and philosophy could contribute to that by thinking a multiplicity of cosmotechnics. But I must at the same time admit that the universality of the technology is something we have accepted. We haven't doubted for hundreds of years. And it's going to take us a long time to resolve these problems. I don't know if we still have time, to be honest, because things are so unpredictable. But at least this is what we can do to think the relation between locality and the modern technology we have inherited, and that we cannot renounce the fact that we are alcoholic moderns today. So that's why, in this journal, we have established, we are trying to explore the question of locality in Latin America, and soon we are also having a call for cosmotechnics or technological thinking in India, a major civilization which has profound thinkings about technology. But the question is, the technology hasn't been thermatized in that tradition. So we have to rediscover, and we have to think what we can do from the perspective of locality. Now, I also have to say add one last point to this question concerning locality, because my discourse on locality is very different from the discourse of locality that you find today in the anti-globalization movement, or or in the reactionary politics that Brian already mentioned in the first question, that people may by mistake misappropriate my effort as a reactionary politics, because this guy wanted to talk about China, wanted to talk about locality, wanted to talk about East. So it's the East against the West and so on. No, this is not what I have in my mind. And actually, in the second part of the question concerning technology, I already anticipated this criticism but no one, people want to criticize you without reading a book, and this has become a symptomatic all the time. But in the second part of the book, I already tried to show how Heidegger and the Kyoto school philosophers, they ended really badly as philosophers on the question of locality, and that is what we have to bear in mind. And this is a kind of a subject that I present in the book, and I will continue exploring, which I called the individuation of thinking. So I'm not asserting that we need to keep a Chinese thinking, an Indian thinking, any thinking bearing a national title. No, this is not my claim, but rather how can we facilitate an individuation of thinking today in the reality that is no longer the same as, let's say, that of the 19th century, when modernization started taking place in large scale in the world, and that result in our situation today, as you have described, as a poor vision of technology.
Should we do one last one?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we can we can close. This is a slightly complex question, but might be answered simply.
Yeah.
See, this last question is from Renzo Filinic. So taking up the notion of cosmotechnics in your dialogue with Viveros de Castro. Viveros at one point makes it clear that the cosmotechnical aspect in Amerindian cultures comes from a ritual exchange and an eschatological aspect of exchange. In this, right? Mm-hmm. So in this sense, how do you observe these transformations of the a priori technical métis? How do you observe this with the posterior relationship that is observed today from this technical epistemic organology?
Well, right. I mean, good question, but also very complicated question. It's complicated for me because I must admit that I'm not expert of Latin American thought, and this is the great difficulty for me to comment on this question. And I know my ignorance, and also at the same time know the importance to engage with this, and that is why we have this journal. And that is why Renzo is also one of the contributors to to this special issue on Latin America, because I think that this question has to be thought collectively. I remember 2 years ago, during a dinner with Eduardo in Rio de Janeiro. That was September 2019, good old time. That appeared to me like a dream of being able to have a walk at on the beach of Ipanema. It's I don't know when this can happen again. We were talking about cosmotechnics, and after several drinks, and Eduardo says that, well, I mean, that was a kind of a joke, but also probably not a joke. That, well, he says to me, ayahuasca is the cosmotechnics of the Amazon, ayahuasca. So how are we going to make sense of that? As what you says, some certain kind of ritual. Of course, ayahuasca probably was not the same thing as what we conceived today, because now it was not, it's a important part of shamanic tourism, that you pay 5,000 euro to have a 10 days of experience in the mid of the forest of the but there is a certain kind of ritual, and as you said, the ritual exchange or eschatological exchange, and that means we need a new interpretation of all these rituals, and to think its relation to the current condition that we have. When I initiate the special issue on Latin America, I must again admit my ignorance. And I was talking to the two editors who I request to edit this special issue, because at the time I had I have no resource. So this are always done from the as a friend, as our friendship. So they returned with this question, a similar question to yours. They said, but we don't really find any relations between these rituals and modern technology. We continue these rituals, some parts in Mexico and in Latin America, but people live as if these two lives are divided, And my answer to them, and that probably comes out of my ignorance, but also come out of a kind of gesture. I said to them that maybe the task is to make the irrelevance relevant again. So maybe the point is not to admit the irrelevance at the first place and then keep them as irrelevant, but rather how can we recognize the necessity or maybe how can we recognize the contingency of this irrelevance, and starting there to articulate a necessity of relevance. So this would be my answer to this big question, because I think it involves a lot of historical analysis, and also from the perspective of epistemology. And I want to emphasize on the importance of epistemology, how these epistemological differences could be thought through. And these epistemological differences could still have a role today in the imagination and design of technology. Because at the very beginning, in my response to Brian's first question, I said that the acceptance of the universality of technology ignores always the ontological and epistemological assumptions within technologies. And this is precisely what we can do when we think about when we wanted to rethink about technologies today, and also the relevance of what we call maybe we can say Latin American thought to that. And I don't think that the question is how to preserve indigenous technology and so on. It's of course it's important, but preservation also means making something part of a museum. That is a modern project. Museum appeared in European modernity, and when you preserve, you put something in a museum, and this is not its greatest contribution, or not the greatest contribution that it could have. So that would be my answer to your question, mainly conceptually, and I would say strategically, rather than giving you an example what could be done, because this is not what I could do.
Well, we're way over time. Yuk, I'm really appreciative of your taking the time. I really hope we can also continue the celebration for art and cosmotechnics in New York, even somewhere else in person, and with some others.
Yeah, thank you very much for the dialogue, and that also allowed me to explain some of the well, not really explain, but trying to point out some of the main ideas in the book, but also the motivations. But the book is strange and it's very complex. It's many years of work.
Completely wild.
But that is how I write. But the next book will be very historical. So there's alteration in my way of writing, but I really appreciate for the work of e-flux and University of Minnesota Press for making this book possible, and for the discussion, and for everyone who participated. I couldn't see who is there, but I really appreciate it. So thank you very much, and I really hope that there will be occasion to deepen some of these questions that I could only touch on the surface, and I hope that there will be occasion, because I must say that I think there was something that I didn't say is something I proposed towards the end of recursivity and contingency, the last paragraph, and that I call for the thinking about a post-European philosophy. And this book is basically one, my response to my own call, by only the very beginning. And this call is a call for a collective project, not a call for, not a task to be performed by an individual. So this has to, the agenda that I would like to push forward has to be a collective project, and that means we all have to work together. And I hope there will be occasions to allow this to be developed elsewhere as well.
Thank you.
So have a nice evening, Brian, and everyone.
Have a nice day.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.